I'm Marcus Williams, 28, and 3 years ago, I was sentenced to 8 years in state prison for armed robbery. The day they read my verdict, I watched my mother collapse in the courtroom as the judge declared me guilty of a crime I didn't commit. For 3 years, I lived in a 6x8 cell, branded as a violent criminal, losing my job, my fiancée, and my faith in the justice system. But last month, security footage from my workplace surfaced during a routine audit footage that showed me clocking out at the exact time the robbery occurred, 15 miles away. The footage the police claimed didn't exist. Now I'm free, but discovering who knew about this evidence and why it was hidden will expose a corruption that goes deeper than I ever imagined. Like and subscribe if you believe the truth always finds. Let me take you back to October 15, 2021, the night that destroyed my life. I was working the evening shift at Riverside Warehouse, same as I had for 3 years. Nothing special about that Thursday. I remember clocking in at 3 p.m., joking with my supervisor about the upcoming weekend, and settling into the familiar rhythm of loading trucks and organizing inventory. The warehouse was busy that night. We had a big shipment going out Friday morning, so the whole team was pushing to get everything ready. I worked alongside Tommy Chen and Mike Rodriguez, good guys, who'd become real friends over the years. We were talking about the football game coming up, making plans to watch it at Mike's place. Around 10:30 p.m., I clocked out for my dinner break. The police report I later saw claimed the armed robbery happened at 10:45 p.m. at a convenience store 15 miles away on the other side of town. 15 miles. In rush hour traffic, that's at least a 25-minute drive. But somehow, according to the prosecution, I managed to drive there, rob the place, and disappear without a trace. I remember that dinner break clearly because I called my mum. She was worried about my late hours, always telling me to eat properly and get enough sleep. We talked for maybe 10 minutes about her doctor's appointment the next day. She'd been having some chest pains, and I was concerned. I promised to drive her to the clinic after my shift ended. After dinner, I clocked back in at 11:15 p.m. The time clock system at Riverside was digital, precise to the minute. Every entry and exit was logged automatically. Tommy and Mike saw me return. We worked together until my shift ended at midnight. I helped load the last truck, cleaned up my station, and headed home. The drive to my apartment took about 20 minutes. I lived in a small one-bedroom place on Maple Street. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. I was saving money, planning to propose to Jessica in the spring. She was a nurse at Memorial Hospital, working nights too, so we'd text each other during our breaks. That night was no different. I got home around 12:30 a.m., tired but satisfied with a good day's work. I texted Jessica goodnight, set my alarm for 8 a.m. so I could take Mum to her appointment, and fell asleep watching late-night television. I had no idea that across town, someone had just committed an armed robbery that would be pinned on me. The next morning started normally. I woke up, showered, and grabbed coffee before heading to Mum's house. She lived in the same neighborhood where I grew up, a modest area with small houses and tree-lined streets. We'd always been close, especially after Dad passed away when I was 16. She worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, and I'd promised myself I'd take care of her when I got established. We were sitting in the clinic waiting room when everything changed. 2 police officers walked through the door, looking official and serious. At first, I thought they were there for someone else, maybe handling some paperwork or following up on a case. Then one of them called my name, Marcus Williams. I stood up, confused. Yes, that's me. You're under arrest for armed robbery. The words didn't make sense. My mother gasped, her face going pale. Other patients in the waiting room stared as the officers approached with handcuffs. I kept thinking there had to be some mistake, some confusion with someone who had the same name. There's been a mistake, I said, my voice surprisingly calm despite the chaos in my head. I work at Riverside Warehouse. I was at work last night. You have the right to remain silent, the officer continued, ignoring my protests. The Miranda rights felt surreal. like something from a television show rather than my actual life. My mother tried to stand, reaching for me, but her legs gave out. A nurse rushed over to help her as they led me away in handcuffs. The last thing I saw was her face, filled with terror and confusion. As the clinic doors closed behind us, that police report became the foundation of their case against me. A single witness claimed to have seen someone matching my description. Fleeing the scene, the store's security camera was supposedly malfunctioned, providing no clear footage of the perpetrator. No fingerprints were found that matched mine. No DNA evidence, no stolen money recovered from my possession. Just that witness statement and what they called circumstantial evidence. My mother, Elena Williams, was 62 years old when I was arrested. She'd spent her entire adult life working as a school cafeteria manager and weekend house cleaner to support our family after Dad died. Her hands were always rough from years of labor, but her heart was pure gold. She believed in hard work, honesty, and taking care of family above all else. The day they arrested me at the clinic, I watched something break inside her. She'd already been dealing with chest pains and high blood pressure, stress from working too many hours, and worrying about everyone except herself. Seeing her only son led away in handcuffs triggered something that never fully healed. During those first weeks in county jail awaiting trial, Mum visited every single day. The visiting hours were from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., and she'd arrive at 1:30, waiting. In line with other families who were going through their own nightmares, she'd sit across from me in that sterile room, separated by thick glass, talking through a phone that made everything sound hollow and distorted. "I know you didn't do this, Marcus," she'd say every time, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "We're going to prove it. We're going to bring you home." She sold her car first. Mum had driven the same Honda Civic for 12 years, religiously maintaining it even when money was tight. She sold it to a neighbor for $3,000 and used the money to hire a private investigator. The Pi took her money and did virtually nothing, a few phone calls, a half-hearted review of the police report, and then he disappeared. When that didn't work, she started calling lawyers. Every attorney in town wanted a retainer she couldn't afford. The public defender assigned to my case seemed overworked and disinterested, carrying a caseload that made it impossible to give anyone proper attention. Mum begged him to investigate the warehouse's time clock records, to interview my co-workers, to check phone records that would prove I called her during my dinner break. "Ma'am, the prosecution has a witness," he'd tell her patiently, like she was a child who didn't understand. "Your son needs to consider a plea deal." She mortgaged her house, the little two-bedroom home where she'd raised me, where Dad had built the front porch with his own hands, where family memories lived in every corner. She borrowed against it to pay for expert witnesses who never materialized, for investigators who took her money and provided nothing useful in return. Every week, I watched her get thinner, more fragile. The stress was literally eating her alive. Her chest pains got worse, but she couldn't afford to miss work for doctor's appointments. She was afraid to take time off, terrified they'd fire her, and she'd lose the insurance that was helping pay for my legal defense. "You don't understand what this is doing to her," Jessica told me during one of her rare visits. My fiancée, former fiancée, really, though neither of us had said it out loud, yet looked exhausted herself. "She's not sleeping, Marcus. She barely eats. Yesterday, I found her crying in the grocery store because she couldn't afford the medicine her doctor prescribed." I felt helpless, trapped behind bars while the woman who'd sacrificed everything for me was slowly destroying herself trying to save me. The guilt was almost worse than the fear of prison. At least in my cell, I was only hurting myself. But Mum was out there, fighting a system that didn't care about truth or justice, spending money she didn't have on a cause that seemed hopeless. The visitor log from my time in county jail tells the story better than I ever could. Every single day for 6 months, Elena Williams signed in at 1:30 p.m. Rain or shine, sick or healthy, she was there. Other inmates would joke about their families giving up after a few weeks, but my mum never missed a day until the trial started and visiting hours were restricted. She'd bring me news from the outside world, updates on neighbors and friends, Anything to keep me connected to the life I was losing. She'd tell me about the letters she was writing to newspapers, to politicians, to anyone who might listen to our story. Most of them never responded, but she kept writing anyway. Your father would be so proud of how you're handling this, she told me one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper. He always said you had his strength and my stubbornness. We're going to need both. But I could see the toll it was taking. Her hands shook when she picked up the phone. Her hair was graying faster than it should have. The woman who'd once worked 16-hour days without complaining was having trouble climbing the stairs to the jail's visiting room. The night before my trial started, she visited one last time under the regular schedule. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by months of stress and financial strain. But her voice was still strong, still determined. No matter what happens. In there, she said, pressing her palm against the glass that separated us. I will never stop believing in you. I will never stop fighting for you. You are my son, and I know your heart. That visitor log became one of the most important pieces of evidence in my life, not for the trial, unfortunately, but for understanding the depth of love and sacrifice that sustained me through the darkest period of my existence. My public defender, David Brennan, was a tired man carrying too many cases and too little hope. When we first met in the cramped conference room at the county jail, he had dark circles under his eyes and a stack of files that seemed to reach the ceiling. My case was just another folder in his overwhelming caseload. Listen, Marcus, he said during our initial meeting, barely looking up from his notes. The prosecution has a witness who identified you. That's going to be hard to overcome. Have you thought about a plea deal? A plea deal? On our first meeting, before he'd even reviewed the evidence or talked to anyone who could verify my alibi, I told him about the time clock at Riverside Warehouse, about my coworkers who saw me there, about the phone call to my mother during my dinner break. He nodded absently and made a few notes, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. I'll look into it, he promised, but his tone suggested he'd already made up his mind about my case. The court transcript from my trial reads, like a masterclass in inadequate legal representation, Brennan failed to subpoena the time clock records from Riverside Warehouse. He never called Tommy Chen or Mike Rodriguez to testify about working alongside me that entire evening. He didn't request my phone records that would have proven I called my mother at 10:35 p.m. from the warehouse break room. Most damaging of all, he never asked the prosecution about security footage from my workplace. The question never came up, the request was never made. If he had asked, if he had pushed for a thorough investigation, the footage that eventually exonerated me would have been discovered 3 years earlier. Instead, the prosecution built their case on the testimony of one witness, a convenience store customer named Raymond Gutierrez, who claimed he saw the robbery and could identify the perpetrator. Gutierrez was a 43-year-old man with a history of drug problems and outstanding warrants in 2 other counties. He'd been in the store buying cigarettes when the robbery occurred, and claimed he got a clear look at the robber's face. He was about 6 feet tall, African American, wearing a dark jacket, Gutierrez testified. I'll never forget those eyes. That's him right there. He pointed directly at me. Brennan's cross-examination was embarrassingly brief. He asked a few basic questions about the lighting in the store, about Gutierrez's distance from the robber, about whether he'd been drinking that night. Gutierrez admitted he'd had a couple beers but insisted his memory was clear. That was it. No follow-up questions about his criminal history. No exploration of potential deals he might have made with prosecutors. No challenge to the reliability of his identification. The prosecution presented their case with confidence and precision. They had photographs of the crime scene, testimony from the store clerk who'd been robbed, and most importantly, they had Gutierrez pointing his finger at me. They painted a picture of a desperate young man who needed quick money and chose armed robbery as his solution. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecutor said during closing arguments, the defendant wants you to believe he was at work during this crime. But where are the witnesses? Where are the time clock records? Where is any evidence to support this alibi? The defense has provided you with nothing but empty claims and desperate stories. He was right, of course. Brennan had provided them with nothing because he'd never bothered to gather the evidence that could have saved me. The most painful part of reading that transcript, years later, was seeing how easily my conviction could have been prevented. The truth was sitting there, waiting to be discovered. My co-workers were ready to testify. The warehouse had detailed employment records. The phone company had logs of my call to Mum. The security footage existed in their digital archives, but Brennan never asked for any of it. When the jury returned after just 3 hours of deliberation, I knew it was over. 3 hours isn't enough time to carefully consider evidence in a serious felony case. It's barely enough time to order lunch and take a bathroom break. They'd made up their minds quickly, and their verdict reflected that speed. We find the defendant guilty of armed robbery in the first degree. My mother's cry echoed through the courtroom. I heard her collapse behind me, heard the commotion as people rushed to help her, but I couldn't turn around. The bailiff was already approaching with handcuffs, and the judge was setting a date for sentencing. Brennan packed up his files and shook my hand. I'm sorry, he said, but he was already thinking about his next case. His next overworked day in an underfunded system that chews up public defenders as quickly as it processes defendants. The judge sentenced me to 8 years in state prison. 8 years for a crime I didn't commit, based on the testimony of one unreliable witness and the complete failure of my legal representation. As they led me away, I caught one last glimpse of my mother being helped from the courtroom, her face pale and her body shaking. That court transcript became a roadmap for everything that went wrong with my case. Every missed opportunity, every unasked question, every piece of evidence that could have proven my innocence, it was all documented. In those pages, a permanent record of how the system failed me completely. Riverside State Penitentiary became my world for 3 years, 3 months, and 16 days. The employment termination letter from the warehouse arrived 2 weeks after my sentencing. Delivered to my mother's house since I obviously couldn't receive mail at my apartment anymore. She brought it to me during a visit, her hands shaking as she passed the letter through the slot. We regret to inform you that due to your criminal conviction, your employment with Riverside Warehouse is terminated effective immediately. It read, 3 years of good work, perfect attendance, positive performance reviews, all erased by a wrongful conviction. Prison is a world unto itself, with its own rules, hierarchies, and survival mechanisms. I was assigned to cell block D, sharing a 6x8 space with a man named Carlos Mendez, who'd been inside for 6 years on a drug trafficking charge. Carlos was older, wiser about prison life, and he took me under his wing during those first terrifying weeks. Keep your head down, mind your own business, and don't trust anyone completely, he advised. But don't be a victim either. Respect is everything in here. The daily routine was mind-numbing. Wake up at 5:30 a.m. for count time, where guards verified every inmate was accounted for. Breakfast at 6 a.m. powdered eggs, stale toast, and coffee that tasted like dirty water. Work detail from 8 a.m. to 11 a.m., usually in the prison laundry or kitchen. Lunch, then more work or educational programs in the afternoon. Dinner at 5 p.m., then back to our cells by 9 p.m. for evening count and lights out. The violence was constant, but usually predictable. Most fights were about respect, territory, or debts. I learned to read the signs, the tension in someone's shoulders, the way conversations stopped when certain people walked by, the subtle shift in atmosphere that meant trouble was coming. I kept to myself as much as possible, but in prison, trouble sometimes finds you whether you're looking for it or not. 3 months into my sentence, I was attacked in the shower by 2 men who thought I was weak, an easy target. They were wrong. Growing up in a tough neighborhood and working in a warehouse had taught me how to handle myself. I fought back hard enough that they left me alone after that, but not before I ended up with a broken nose and 3 stitches above my left eye. The hardest part wasn't the violence or the terrible food or the constant noise. It was watching my life on the outside slowly disappear. Jessica visited twice in the first month, and I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. She still loved me, but the strain was killing our relationship. "I can't do this for 8 years, Marcus," she told me during her last visit, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, but I can't wait that long. I can't live like this." I understood, but it still felt like another part of my heart being ripped away. She was a good woman who deserved better than a fiancé in prison for armed robbery. A week later, she returned my engagement ring through my mother, along with a letter explaining that she was moving to another city to start fresh. The termination letter from Riverside hurt almost as much as losing Jessica. That job had been my pride, my proof that I was building something meaningful with my life. I'd started in the lowest position and worked my way up to shift supervisor, earning the respect of my coworkers and management. Now, it was gone, along with any hope of returning to that career when I got out. But prison also taught me about resilience I never knew I possessed. I started attending GED classes to help other inmates who'd never finished high school. I joined the prison library committee, helping organize books and educational materials. I wrote letters for inmates who couldn't read or write, helping them stay connected to their families. Most importantly, I met other men who'd been wrongfully convicted. There was James Washington, serving 15 years for a rape he didn't commit, until DNA evidence eventually freed him. There was Miguel Santos, convicted of murder based on false testimony from a witness who later recanted. These men taught me that surviving prison wasn't just about getting through each date, was about maintaining your dignity, your sense of self, and your hope for eventual justice. "The system broke down for us," James told me one evening as we sat in the prison yard, watching the sunset through razor wire. "But that doesn't mean we have to break down to every day you wake up innocent. You prove they couldn't destroy who you really are." I started writing in a journal, documenting my experiences and my memories of the night I was arrested. I wrote letters to lawyers, to innocence projects, to anyone who might listen to my story. Most of them went unanswered, but writing them kept me focused on the truth rather than the despair that threatened to consume me. The employment termination letter became a symbol of everything I'd lost: my job, my career, my future prospects. But it also reminded me of what I'd been before. This nightmare began, a hard-working man with integrity and purpose. Prison could take my freedom, but it couldn't take away who I really was inside. Sarah Chen found me in my 3rd year of imprisonment, but it felt like she'd been searching for my case her entire career. She was a civil rights attorney specializing in wrongful convictions, working with the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project out of a small office in downtown Baltimore. At 34, she'd already helped exonerate 7 innocent people, but she told me later that something about my case kept her awake at night. "I read about your conviction in a legal database," she explained during our first meeting in the prison's attorney conference room. The whole thing felt wrong. One witness, no physical evidence, inadequate legal representation. It had all the hallmarks of a wrongful conviction. Sarah was different from every other lawyer I'd encountered. She actually listened when I talked. She took notes, asked follow-up questions, and looked me in the eye when I told her I was innocent. After 3 years of being treated like a criminal by everyone in the legal system, her belief in me felt like oxygen to a drowning man. She'd been working on wrongful conviction cases for 8 years, inspired by her law school clinic where she'd helped free an innocent man who'd spent 12 years in prison for murder. That experience taught her to recognize the patterns: rushed investigations, overconfident prosecutors, witnesses with questionable motives, and defense attorneys who'd given up before they started. "The first thing I want to do is review every piece of evidence from your case," she told me. "Then I want to talk to everyone who was involved: your coworkers, the police officers, the prosecutor, even that witness who identified you. Something doesn't add up, and I'm going to find out what." The pro bono agreement she had me sign was the first document I'd seen in years that gave me hope. Sarah's law firm, Chen and Associates, specialized in civil rights cases and maintained a fund specifically for wrongful conviction investigations. They wouldn't charge me anything, but they expected complete honesty and cooperation in return. "I need you to tell me everything," she said, pulling out a legal pad. "Every detail from that night, every conversation with your previous lawyer. Every person who might have information about your case. Don't leave anything out, even if you think it's not important. Over the next 2 hours, I told her my story from the beginning. She interrupted frequently with questions that my previous attorney had never asked. What time exactly did I clock out for dinner? Who else was in the break room when I called my mother? Did the warehouse have security cameras? Had anyone ever requested the time clock records? That last question hit me like a physical blow. In 3 years, through months of investigation and a complete trial, no one had ever requested the basic employment records that would have proven my innocence. Sarah stared at me for a long moment after I confirmed this, then wrote something on her notepad and underlined it 3 times. "Marcus, I'm going to be honest with you," she said, closing her notepad and looking directly at me. "Your previous attorney committed malpractice. Not asking for those records, not interviewing your co-workers, not challenging the witness identification. It's inexcusable. But the good news is that all of that evidence still exists." Sarah explained that she would file a post-conviction appeal based on ineffective assistance of counsel. She'd subpoenaed the warehouse records, interview my former co-workers, and reconstruct the timeline that should have been presented at my trial. She'd also investigate the witness who identified me, looking for any inconsistencies or motivations that might have been overlooked. "This process takes time," she warned me. "It could be months, or even years before we get a hearing. The system moves slowly, especially when we're asking them to admit they made a mistake. But I've done this before, and I know what we're up against." What impressed me most about Sarah was her thoroughness. She didn't just take my word for anything. She verified every detail, cross-referenced every claim, and built her case on documentary evidence rather than emotional appeals. She understood that judges and prosecutors would be skeptical of any attempt to overturn a conviction, so everything had to be bulletproof. During her second visit, she brought news that changed everything. She'd already contacted Riverside Warehouse and discovered that they maintained digital archives of all time clock data going back 7 years. The records from October 15, 2021 still existed, sitting in a computer server waiting to be retrieved. "They're going to produce those records," she told me, her excitement barely contained. "Marcus, if those records show what you've told me, we have the foundation for your exoneration." Sarah also explained the broader context of my case. Wrongful convictions weren't rare. Studies suggested that between 2% and 5% of all prisoners were innocent. The causes were usually the same: eyewitness misidentification, false confessions, prosecutorial misconduct, inadequate legal defense, and perjury or false accusations. "Your case has several of these factors," she noted. "Questionable witness identification, clearly inadequate defense representation, and what appears to be investigative tunnel vision by the police. Once they decided you were their suspect, they stopped looking for evidence that might contradict that theory." The pro bono agreement represented more than just free legal representation, was a commitment from someone who believed in justice. Rather than just winning cases, Sarah could have been making significantly more money in corporate law. But she'd chosen to spend her career fighting for people like me, who'd been failed by the system. As she gathered her papers to leave that first day, Sarah made me a promise that sustained me through the long months ahead. "Marcus, I can't guarantee that we'll win, but I can promise you this SI will investigate every lead, challenge every assumption, and fight for you as hard as I've ever fought for anyone. You deserve justice, and I'm going to do everything in my power to get it for you." The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, almost 4 months after Sarah had taken my case. I was working in the prison library, helping inmates with their legal research, when the guard told me I had an urgent attorney visit. The excitement in Sarah's voice was barely contained as she sat across from me in the familiar conference room. "Marcus, we found it," she said, sliding a printed document across the table. "The security footage from Riverside Warehouse. It exists, it's clear, and it proves everything you've told me." The document was a technical report from the warehouse's security audit, conducted by an outside company that specialized in corporate compliance reviews. During their routine examination of the company's digital security systems, they've discovered archived footage that had been automatically stored but never properly catalogued. The timestamp on the footage was clear and indisputable. October 15, 2021, 10:43 p.m. The report included still frames from the security camera that covered the employee break room and time clock area. There I was, clear as day, swiping my ID card to clock back in from my dinner break at exactly 10:43 p.m. The armed robbery had occurred at 10:45 p.m., 15 miles away. Even with no traffic, it would have been physically impossible for me to drive from the warehouse to the convenience store in 2 minutes. "This is our smoking gun," Sarah explained, her hands trembling slightly with excitement. "But Marcus, this footage was available during your original trial. The police never requested it. Your attorney never asked for it, and the prosecution never disclosed its existence. This represents a massive failure of the justice system." The technical specifications in the report showed that Riverside Warehouse maintained a sophisticated digital security system that automatically archived all footage for 7 years. The system was designed for loss prevention and employee monitoring, recording everything that happened in common areas, including break rooms, parking lots, and entry points. What made the footage especially compelling was its meta information embedded in the video file that proved its authenticity. The timestamp couldn't be altered without leaving traces that forensic experts could detect. The camera's angle showed not just me clocking in, but also other employees in the background, confirming that this was genuine workplace footage from the night in question. Sarah had worked with a digital forensics expert to analyze the footage frame by frame. The expert's report confirmed that I appeared relaxed and unhurried as I returned from my dinner break, showing no signs of having just committed an armed robbery. My clothing matched what I'd described: work pants and a Riverside Warehouse polo shirt, not the dark jacket the witness had described. "The prosecution's timeline is completely destroyed by this footage," Sarah explained. "They claimed you robbed the store at 10:45 p.m., but here you are at work at 10:43 p.m. Their entire case falls apart." Even more damaging was the revelation that this footage had been preserved in the warehouse's digital archives throughout my entire trial and imprisonment. A simple subpoena, a basic request for security footage, would have uncovered this evidence. 3 years earlier, the fact that no one had bothered to ask for it represented either gross incompetence or willful ignorance. The security company's audit report also revealed something troubling about the police investigation. Detective Rodriguez had contacted Riverside Warehouse 2 days after my arrest, asking general questions about my employment. The warehouse security manager had offered to provide any footage or records that might be helpful, but Rodriguez never followed up with a formal request. This suggests that the police weren't interested in finding evidence that might contradict their theory, Sarah noted. "Once they decided you were their suspect, they stopped investigating other possibilities." The footage also corroborated other details of my story that had never been properly investigated. The timestamp showed me making a phone call during my dinner break, supporting my claim that I'd called my mother. Phone records, which Sarah had since obtained, confirmed a call from my cell phone to my mother's number at 10:35 p.m., lasting 8 minutes. What made this discovery even more significant was the chain of custody. The security footage had been continuously stored on the warehouse's servers, never leaving their control or being subject to tampering. Unlike witness testimony, which could be influenced by suggestion or false memory, this digital evidence was objective and irrefutable. Sarah brought additional documentation showing that similar footage had been used in other criminal cases, both to convict and exonerate defendants. Courts had consistently ruled that properly authenticated security footage was among the most reliable forms of evidence, often trumping eyewitness testimony that psychological research had shown to be notoriously unreliable. "The next step is filing a motion with the court," Sarah explained. "We're going to request an immediate hearing based on newly discovered evidence. This footage didn't exist at the time of your trial, not because it wasn't available, but because no one bothered to look for it. The timestamp on that security footage became the most important moment in my life. 10:43 p.m. October 15, 2021. Those 8 digits and a colon proved my innocence more definitively than any witness testimony or circumstantial evidence. They represented the difference between 8 years in prison and freedom, between a life destroyed and a life reclaimed. As Sarah packed up the documents and prepared to leave, she made me a promise that I'd been waiting 3 years to hear. Marcus, this is it. This footage is going to bring you home. The security footage, timestamp, concrete, digital, irrefutable proof that I was exactly where I said I was when the crime occurred. After 3 years of maintaining my innocence with nothing but my word to support it, I finally had evidence that no jury could ignore. District Attorney Margaret Hoffman had built her career on being tough on crime, and she wasn't about to let a wrongful conviction case damage her reputation without a fight. When Sarah Chen requested a meeting to present the security footage evidence, Hoffman agreed to see her, but the meeting took place in the DA's imposing office with 2 assistant prosecutors present as witnesses. Ms. Chen, I've reviewed your motion and the evidence you claim to have discovered, Hoffman said, her tone cold and professional. While the footage is interesting, it doesn't necessarily prove innocence. There could be explanations for these timestamps. Sarah had prepared for this resistance. She brought enlarged photographs of the security footage, the digital forensics report, and a timeline that showed the physical impossibility of my committing the crime. She laid everything out on Hoffman's conference table, like pieces of a puzzle that could only fit together one way. With respect, District Attorney Hoffman, this isn't about interesting footage, it's about conclusive proof of innocence, Sarah responded firmly. Marcus Williams was at work, on camera, at the time of the robbery. The metadata confirms the authenticity of this footage, and expert analysis shows it hasn't been tampered with. The evidence suppression motion that Sarah filed the next day became a bombshell in the local legal community. In careful, precise language, she documented not just the existence of the exonerating footage, but the systematic failure of the investigation and prosecution. The motion accused the police of tunnel vision, the prosecution of failing to conduct due diligence, and my original attorney of ineffective assistance of counsel. The state's case against Mr. Williams was built on a foundation of investigative shortcuts and prosecutorial overconfidence, the motion read. The security footage that conclusively proves his innocence was readily available throughout the original investigation and trial, yet no one bothered to request it. The motion detailed how Detective Rodriguez had been offered access to warehouse security footage but never followed up with a formal request. It showed how the prosecution had relied entirely on a single witness identification without seeking corroborating evidence. Most damaging, it demonstrated how my public defender had failed to conduct even basic investigation into my alibi. Assistant District Attorney James Morrison, who had prosecuted my case 3 years earlier, was assigned to respond to Sarah's motion. Morrison was in his 50s, a career prosecutor who took pride in his conviction rate. Having one of his cases overturned would be a professional embarrassment, especially one that garnered media attention. We stand by the jury's verdict, Morrison said in a statement to the local newspaper. Defense attorneys often claim to have new evidence years after trial. The courts have procedures for reviewing these claims, and we're confident the original conviction will be upheld. But privately, the DA's office was scrambling. Sarah had done something that prosecutors hate. She'd documented their mistakes in excruciating detail. The motion didn't just claim innocence, it provided a step-by-step analysis of how the wrongful conviction had occurred, and who was responsible for each failure. The political pressure began almost immediately. Local civil rights organizations rallied around my case, organizing protests outside the courthouse and demanding accountability. The NAACP issued a statement calling for a review of all convictions obtained by Detective Rodriguez. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Innocent Man's 3 Years Behind Bars, How the System Failed." Judge Patricia Hawkins, who had presided over my original trial, was assigned to hear Sarah's motion. This created an awkward situation. She was being asked to essentially admit that her courtroom had been the site of a wrongful conviction. Judges don't like to acknowledge that they've sent innocent people to prison, even when presented with clear evidence. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, but the DA's office tried every procedural maneuver to delay it. They filed motions challenging the authenticity of the footage, questioning Sarah's standing to represent me, and arguing that the evidence should have been presented years earlier. Sarah countered each motion with devastating precision. She brought in Dr. Michael Torres, a digital forensics expert from Johns Hopkins University, who testified that the security footage was authentic and had been properly preserved. She presented testimony from warehouse employees who confirmed that the security system had been functioning normally on the night of the robbery. Most importantly, she documented how the police and prosecution had actively avoided seeking evidence that might contradict their theory of the case. Internal police reports, obtained through subpoena, showed that Detective Rodriguez had closed his investigation within 48 hours of my arrest, never interviewing potential witnesses or checking my alibi. This wasn't just negligent investigation, Sarah argued in court. This was willful blindness to evidence that would have prevented a wrongful conviction. The warehouse security manager, Robert Chang, testified that he had specifically told Detective Rodriguez about the company's security cameras and offered to provide any footage that might be relevant. Rodriguez had thanked him but never followed up with a formal request. Chang had assumed the police weren't interested in the footage. I kept wondering why they never came back for the video, Chang testified. We had cameras everywhere, including the break room where employees clock in and out. It seemed like basic police work to check those recordings. The evidence suppression motion forced the prosecution to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their conviction of me had been based on inadequate investigation and a rush to judgment. The security footage didn't just prove my innocence. It exposed the systemic problems that led to wrongful convictions throughout the criminal justice system. As the hearing date approached, Sarah received calls from other attorneys representing potentially innocent clients. Word was spreading through the legal community that she had uncovered evidence of broader problems with investigations conducted by Detective Rodriguez and prosecutions handled by Morrison's unit. This case is bigger than just Marcus Williams, Sarah told me during one of our preparation meetings. It's about how the system prioritizes convictions over truth, and how innocent people get swept up in that machinery. The evidence suppression motion became a roadmap for institutional change, documenting not just what went wrong in my case, but how similar failures could be prevented in the future. Detective Frank Rodriguez had been with the Metropolitan Police Department for 18 years when he caught my case. His personnel file, obtained through Sarah's discovery motions, painted a picture of a competent officer under increasing pressure to solve cases quickly. In the 3 months before my arrest, his caseload had tripled due to budget cuts and personnel shortages. What Sarah discovered in Rodriguez's personal notes changed everything we thought we knew about my investigation. The handwritten notebook he kept during the case contained entries that were never included in official police reports, entries that showed he'd had serious doubts about my guilt from the very beginning. Witness seemed shaky, Rodriguez had written after his first interview with Raymond Gutierrez. Changed his story twice about the lighting in the store. Claims he got a good look at the perp's face, but admits he'd been drinking. Need to verify his account. That verification never happened. According to the official reports, Rodriguez had considered Gutierrez a reliable witness whose testimony was consistent and credible. But his personal notes told a different story of an officer who recognized the weaknesses in his case but felt pressured to move forward anyway. Sarah had subpoenaed Rodriguez to testify at my hearing, and she'd spent weeks preparing for his cross-examination. She'd found 3 other cases from the same time period where Rodriguez had obtained quick convictions based on questionable witness identifications. In each case, the investigations had been rushed, alternative suspects hadn't been thoroughly pursued, and exonerating evidence had been overlooked. Detective Rodriguez, did you interview any of Mr. Williams's co-workers who could verify his whereabouts on the night of the robbery? Sarah asked during the hearing. No, I did not, Rodriguez admitted, shifting uncomfortably in the witness chair. Did you request security footage from his workplace? No. Did you obtain phone records that could corroborate his alibi? No. In fact, Detective Rodriguez, you closed this investigation within 48 hours of the arrest, correct? Rodriguez hesitated. Before answering, yes, that's correct. But it was his personal notes that revealed the most damaging information. In one entry, dated 2 days after my arrest, Rodriguez had written, "Williams doesn't fit the profile. No criminal history, steady employment, family support, but witness ID is solid, and Captain wants this case closed fast." The pressure from his superiors was documented throughout his notes. Captain Dennis Walsh had implemented a new policy requiring detectives to close cases within 72 hours whenever possible. A directive that came from the mayor's office in response to public complaints about unsolved crimes. Rodriguez's notes showed that he'd been explicitly told that my case was a slam dunk. That shouldn't require extensive investigation. Got the call that matches the description Rodriguez had written after Gutierrez identified me from a photo lineup. Captain says wrap it up and move on to the next case. Too many open files on my desk. What made Rodriguez's situation more complicated was his own awareness of the system's flaws. His notes contained several references to concerns about eyewitness identification, particularly in cases involving cross-racial identification. He'd attended training seminars about the unreliability of witness testimony and the importance of corroborating evidence. Gutierrez is white, Williams is black, he'd written. Research shows cross-racial ID is less reliable. Should probably do a lineup with similar-looking suspects, but don't have time with current caseload. That lineup never happened either. Instead, Rodriguez had shown Gutierrez a single photograph of me, a practice that police training explicitly discourages because it suggests to the witness that the person shown is the suspect. Proper procedure would have been to show Gutierrez several photographs of similar-looking men and see if he could pick me out. During his testimony, Rodriguez seemed torn between defending his investigation and acknowledging its shortcomings. He was a career officer who took pride in his work, but he was also someone who understood that he'd cut corners under pressure from his superiors. Detective Rodriguez, Sarah continued, your notes indicate that you had reservations about the reliability of Mr. Gutierrez's identification. Can you explain why you didn't pursue additional investigation? I was under significant pressure to close cases quickly, Rodriguez admitted. We had budget constraints, staffing shortages, and explicit directives from command staff to resolve investigations efficiently. But efficiency shouldn't come at the expense of accuracy, should it? No, it shouldn't. The most revealing entry in Rodriguez's notes came from a week after my conviction, when he'd learned about another armed robbery with similarities to my case. The perpetrator had been caught on security camera, and Rodriguez noted that he looked nothing like me. The real robber was shorter, stockier, and wore distinctive clothing that matched witness descriptions from other recent robberies. Possible serial robber, Rodriguez had written. Williams' case doesn't fit the pattern. May have arrested the wrong guy. That entry was never reported to prosecutors or defense attorneys. Rodriguez had simply filed it away and moved on to other cases, leaving me to serve time for a crime that he suspected I hadn't committed. When Sarah confronted him with this note during his testimony, Rodriguez's composure finally cracked. He'd been carrying the weight of his doubts for 3 years, knowing that an innocent man was in prison but unable or unwilling to speak up about his mistakes. I had concerns, he admitted quietly. But the case had been prosecuted. The jury had convicted, and I was told that second-guessing closed cases wasn't my job. Whose job was it, detective? I don't know. Rodriguez's personal notes became the smoking gun that revealed not just individual misconduct, but systemic pressure. That led to wrongful convictions. They showed how budget constraints, political pressure, and institutional priorities could corrupt the search for truth that should be at the heart of every criminal investigation. After his testimony, Rodriguez approached Sarah in the courthouse hallway. He looked older, more tired than his 52 years, carrying the burden of mistakes that had cost me 3 years of my life. I'm sorry, he said simply. I should have done better. Officer Michael Santos had been working in the corrections department at Riverside State Penitentiary for 12 years when I arrived. Unlike many guards who viewed inmates as problems to be managed, Santos actually paid attention to the people. Under his supervision, he noticed things who caused trouble, who kept to themselves, who seemed genuinely remorseful for their crimes. And he noticed that I didn't belong there. Williams was different from the start. Santos would later testify at my hearing. Most guys come in angry, scared, or defiant. Marcus came in confused. He kept asking questions about the appeals process, about how to contact lawyers, about how someone could be convicted without evidence. It wasn't the behavior of a guilty man trying to game the system, it was someone genuinely bewildered by what had happened to him. The testimony that Santos provided became one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in my case. Not because it proved my innocence directly, but because it showed that even corrections officers, people trained to be skeptical of inmates, claims could see that something was wrong with my conviction. Santos had observed my behavior during my 3 years at Riverside. He noted that I never received disciplinary reports, never got into fights except when defending myself, and spent most of my free time in the library or helping other inmates with their legal cases. This wasn't the profile of a violent criminal who had committed armed robbery. In 12 years, I've supervised thousands of inmates, Santos testified. You develop an instinct about people who's dangerous, who's likely to re-offend, who's genuinely trying to change their life. Marcus Williams was one of the most obviously innocent people I've ever encountered in this job. Santos wasn't the only corrections officer who supported my case. Sergeant Patricia Gomez, who supervised the prison library where I worked, wrote a letter to Sarah detailing my character and behavior. Her observations painted a picture of someone who was using his time constructively, despite the injustice of his situation. Marcus became one of our most valuable inmate workers, Gomez wrote. He helped organize our legal research materials, assisted other inmates with their appeals, and maintained perfect attendance and attitude despite his circumstances. His behavior was consistently that of someone who believed the truth would eventually prevail. Even more compelling was the support I received from fellow inmates. James Washington, the man serving 15 years for a rape he didn't commit, had become something of a mentor during my first year inside. When Sarah contacted him for a character reference, he provided a detailed account of our conversations about maintaining innocence in the face of systemic injustice. Marcus never wavered in his claim of innocence, Washington wrote in his statement. In 3 years, I never heard him express guilt, remorse for the crime he was convicted of, or acceptance that he belonged in prison. This is unusual. Most innocent men eventually have moments of doubt or anger where they consider admitting guilt just to move forward. Marcus never did. The prison chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, had counseled me regularly during my incarceration. His testimony provided insight into my mental state and moral character that courtroom proceedings rarely capture. Father O'Brien had served the prison for 8 years and counseled hundreds of inmates dealing with guilt, redemption, and rehabilitation. Marcus came to me not seeking forgiveness for his crime, but seeking strength to endure injustice, Father O'Brien testified. In all my conversations with him, he maintained his innocence while showing genuine concern for the victim of the robbery he didn't commit. This psychological profile is very consistent with wrongful conviction cases I've encountered. Dr. Patricia Vance, the prison psychologist who had evaluated me annually, provided professional assessment of my mental health and behavior patterns. Her reports, which Sarah subpoenaed as part of the appeal process, showed consistently that I displayed none of the psychological markers associated with violent criminals or armed robbers. Mr. Williams's psychological profile indicated low risk for violence, high social functioning, and strong moral reasoning, Dr. Vance explained. In her testimony, his consistent claims of innocence, combined with his behavior patterns, suggested genuine wrongful conviction rather than denial or manipulation. Even inmates who barely knew me came forward to support my case. Carlos Mendez, my cellmate for the first 2 years, provided a statement describing our daily conversations and my unwavering insistence on innocence. He noted that I never discussed plans for future crimes, never glorified criminal behavior, and consistently expressed faith that the truth would eventually emerge. Living with someone in a 6B8 cell, you learn who they really are, Mendez wrote. Marcus talked about his mother, his lost job, his plans to help other wrongfully convicted people when he got out. He never talked about the robbery because he didn't commit it. The prison maintenance supervisor, Robert Kim, testified about my work ethic and reliability during the 18 months I spent on his crew. He described me as someone who took pride in doing quality work, despite having no incentive to excel in a prison job. Marcus treated every assignment seriously, Kim testified. He showed up on time, worked hard, and helped train new inmates. This isn't typical behavior for someone who's angry about their conviction or planning to return to criminal activity. Perhaps the most unexpected support came from other guards who had initially been skeptical of my claims. Officer David Thompson had been suspicious of my insistence on innocence, assuming it was typical inmate denial. But over time, my consistent behavior and genuine concern for justice had changed his perspective. I've heard every excuse, every denial, every story inmates tell to justify their crimes, Thompson testified. Marcus Williams never made excuses or tried to justify anything. He simply maintained that he was innocent and that the truth would eventually come out. After 3 years of observing him, I believe he was telling the truth. The corrections staff testimony became a powerful counter-narrative to the prosecution's portrayal of me as a dangerous criminal. These were professionals trained to assess risk and behavior, and their collective assessment was that I didn't belong in prison. Their testimony also highlighted something important about the criminal justice system. The people who work most closely with inmates often develop the clearest sense of who has been wrongfully convicted. Guards, counselors, and prison staff see behavior patterns that courtrooms never witness, and their observations can provide crucial insight into the reality of innocence claims. The DNA match report arrived at Sarah's office on a Friday afternoon in late April, 4 months after she'd taken my case. The state crime lab had finally processed evidence from the convenience store, robbery evidence that had been sitting in storage for 3 years while I served time for a crime I didn't commit. The report was clinical in its language, but devastating in its implications. DNA found on the store counter and cash register matched Kevin Bradley, a 31-year-old career criminal with a rap sheet that included multiple armed robberies across 3 states. Bradley had been arrested 2 weeks earlier for a similar convenience store robbery in Virginia, and his DNA profile had triggered matches to several unsolved cases, including mine. Marcus, we found him, Sarah said during her next visit, her voice barely containing her excitement. We found the man who actually robbed that store. Kevin Bradley's criminal history read like a textbook case of escalating violence. He'd started with petty theft in his teens, graduated to burglary in his 20s, and had been committing armed robberies for the past 5 years. His method was always the same target: convenience stores in the early evening. Wear dark clothing to obscure his appearance, and flee quickly in a stolen vehicle. The DNA evidence wasn't just conclusive, it was overwhelming. Bradley's fingerprints were also found on the store's door handle and the cash register. Security footage from nearby businesses showed a man matching Bradley's description fleeing the scene. Most damaging of all, police had recovered the gun used in the robbery from Bradley's apartment when they arrested him for the Virginia crime. Sarah obtained Bradley's complete criminal file, and the pattern was unmistakable. In the 6 months before my arrest, Bradley had committed nearly identical robberies in 4 different cities. Each crime followed the same script: evening hours, small convenience stores, demands for cash from the register, quick escape on foot to a waiting vehicle. What made the discovery even more infuriating was that Bradley had been a suspect in several similar robberies at the time of my arrest. Detective Rodriguez's notes, which Sarah had subpoenaed, contained references to a serial convenience store robber who was active in the metropolitan area, but Rodriguez had never connected Bradley to my case. Despite the obvious similarities, the lab report showed that Bradley's DNA was not only present at the crime scene, but it was fresh deposited on the night of the robbery, not from some previous visit to the store. The DNA was found in multiple locations that would only have been touched by the perpetrator, including the interior of the cash register drawer that the robber had opened. Even more compelling was the confession Bradley eventually gave to his attorney, faced with overwhelming evidence linking him to multiple robberies, including the one I'd been convicted for. Bradley admitted to a pattern of convenience store robberies stretching back several years. His confession included specific details about my case that had never been made public, details that only the real perpetrator could have known. "I hit that place on Harper Street back in October 2021. Bradley told his lawyer during a recorded conversation that was later turned over to prosecutors. "Easy score, maybe $300 from the register. Clerk was scared. Customer ran out when I pulled the gun. I was gone before the cops even got the call." Bradley's description of the robbery matched the store clerk's account perfectly, down to details that hadn't been included in police reports or news coverage. He knew the exact layout of the store, the location of the security camera that had malfunctioned, and the escape route he'd used through the back alley. What made Bradley's confession particularly credible was that he had no incentive to lie about this particular crime. He was already facing multiple life sentences for his other robberies, so admitting to one more conviction wouldn't significantly increase his punishment. His lawyer had advised him to cooperate fully in hopes of avoiding the death penalty. The prosecution in Bradley's case contacted Sarah directly to share his confession. They were embarrassed by the revelation that an innocent man had been convicted for Bradley's crime, and they wanted to cooperate fully in correcting the injustice. The Virginia prosecutor, Jennifer Walsh, had handled dozens of similar cases and recognized the hallmarks of wrongful conviction. "This is exactly the kind of case that keeps prosecutors awake at night," Walsh told Sarah during their phone conversation. "An innocent man serving time while the real perpetrator continues committing crimes." Bradley's confession is detailed, credible, and completely exonerates Mr. Williams. The DNA match report also revealed why the original investigation had gone wrong. Bradley bore a superficial resemblance to me, both African American men in our 20s, both about 6 feet tall, but that's where the similarities ended. Bradley was stockier, had different facial features, and bore distinctive tattoos that the witness Raymond Gutierrez had never mentioned. The cross-racial identification problem that Detective Rodriguez had noted in his personal files had played out exactly as research predicted. Gutierrez, a white witness, had been unable to accurately distinguish between two black men who looked nothing alike to people who knew us. This type of misidentification was so common that police departments had implemented specific protocols to prevent it, protocols that Rodriguez had ignored. Bradley's arrest record showed that he'd been picked up for questioning about other robberies twice during the 3 years I was in prison. Each time, he'd been released due to lack of evidence, even though his DNA was on file and could have been compared to evidence from my case. The simple forensic test that eventually exonerated me could have been performed at any time during my incarceration. When Sarah showed me Bradley's photograph, I stared at it for a long time. This was the man whose crimes had cost me 3 years of my life, destroyed my engagement, broken my mother's health, and shattered my faith in justice. He looked nothing like Metha. Witness identification that had convinced a jury of my guilt was completely wrong. But what I felt wasn't anger, it was vindication. After 3 years of people telling me I was lying about my innocence, here was scientific proof that I'd been telling the truth all along. The DNA match report was more than evidence, it was validation of everything I'd maintained since the day of my arrest. The real perpetrator had been found, and with him, the key to my freedom. The exoneration order arrived on June 18, 2024, a single-page document that changed everything. Judge Patricia Hawkins had reviewed the security footage, the DNA evidence, and Kevin Bradley's confession. And her conclusion was unequivocal, based on clear and convincing evidence of actual innocence. The conviction of Marcus Williams is hereby vacated, and all charges are dismissed with prejudice. Sarah called me with the news at 8:30 a.m. I was working in the prison library, helping another inmate research his appeal, when the guard told me I had an urgent attorney call. Sarah's voice was shaking with emotion as she read the judge's order. Over the phone, "Marcus, you're going home today," she said, and I heard her crying on the other end of the line. "It's over. You're free." The next 6 hours passed in a blur of paperwork, property collection, and surreal moments of transition from prisoner to free man. The same guards who had supervised me for 3 years were now shaking my hand and wishing me luck. Carlos Mendez, my former cellmate, hugged me and made me promise to help other innocent men still trapped in the system. Don't forget us, hermano. Esaid. Don't forget what this place does to innocent people. I walked through the same doors I'd entered 3 years earlier, but everything was different. The world outside looked brighter, sounds seemed sharper, and the simple act of breathing fresh air felt like a miracle. Sarah was waiting for me in the parking lot with my mother, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. My mother looked older, frailer than when I'd last seen her outside those prison walls. 3 years of stress and worry had taken their toll. Her hair was completely grey now, and she needed a cane to walk steadily. But her smile was the same, and when she hugged me, I felt like that scared teenager who'd lost his father and needed his mother's strength to survive. I knew this day would come, she whispered in my ear. I never stopped believing. The ride home was overwhelming. Everything looked different. New buildings, updated signs, changes that had occurred while my life was frozen in prison time. Sarah explained that media outlets were already calling about interviews, that civil rights organizations wanted to use my case as an example of systemic reform needs. But all I could focus on was the simple freedom to look out a car window and choose where to go. My mother had kept my apartment for the first year of my imprisonment, hoping the appeals process would bring me home quickly. When that became financially impossible, she'd moved my belongings to her house and converted her basement into a temporary bedroom. It wasn't much, but it was freedom, the ability to close a door, to have privacy, to make choices about when to sleep and what to eat. That first night of freedom was harder than I'd expected. Prison had conditioned me to institutional rhythm slides out at 9 p.m. Wake up at 5:30 a.m., structured mealtimes and supervised activities. Now I had complete control over my schedule, and the freedom felt almost paralyzing. I found myself staying awake until 3 a.m. just because I could. The exoneration order was more than a legal document. It was official acknowledgement that the system had failed catastrophically. Judge Hawkins had included language in her ruling that went beyond simply vacating my conviction. She criticized the police investigation, the prosecution's failure to seek exonerating evidence, and my original attorney's inadequate representation. This case represents a systematic breakdown of the safeguards designed to prevent wrongful convictions, she wrote. The failure to request security footage, interview witnesses, or properly investigate the defendant's alibi constituted a miscarriage of justice that has deprived Mr. Williams of 3 years of his life. The judge also ordered the state to expunge my criminal record completely, as if the conviction had never existed. This was crucial for my future employers, landlords, and others who might run background checks would find no trace of the armed robbery conviction that had branded me a violent criminal. But expunging the legal record couldn't erase the personal cost of wrongful imprisonment. 3 years of my life were gone forever. My engagement to Jessica had ended, my career at the warehouse was destroyed, and my mother's health had been permanently damaged by the stress of fighting for my freedom. Sarah had warned me about the psychological challenges of readjustment. Many exonerees struggled with post-traumatic stress, difficulty trusting institutions, and problems adapting to technological and social changes that had occurred during their imprisonment. She'd connected me with counselors who specialized in helping wrongfully convicted people rebuild their lives. The world kept moving while you were inside, Dr. Lisa Martinez explained during our first therapy session. Your friends got married, started careers, bought houses, normal life progression that was stolen from you. It's natural to feel angry, lost, or overwhelmed by trying to catch up. The media attention was intense but supportive. Local news stations ran stories about my exoneration, focusing on the failures that led to my wrongful conviction. National civil rights organizations reached out, wanting to feature my case in their campaigns for criminal justice reform. The attention was validating finally. People were listening to the truth I'd been telling for 3 years. But the most Meaningful validation came from unexpected sources. Tommy Chen and Mike Rodriguez, my former co-workers from the warehouse, came to my mother's house the day after my release. They'd followed my case through the news and felt guilty that they'd never been called to testify about working with me the night of the robbery. "We would have told them you were here all night," Tommy said, his voice filled with regret. "We had no idea that your lawyer never contacted us." The exoneration order represented more than personal vindication. It was a public acknowledgement that innocent people do go to prison, that the system makes mistakes, and that truth can prevail even after years of injustice. But it was also a beginning rather than an ending, the first step in rebuilding a life that had been destroyed by wrongful conviction. Standing in my mother's backyard that first evening of freedom, watching the sunset without bars or razor wire blocking my view, I understood that the real work was just beginning. I was free, but I was also responsible for making sure that freedom meant something not just for me, but for all the innocent people still trapped in the system that had failed us all. 3 weeks after my exoneration, Sarah Chen sat across from me in her law office with a stack of legal documents that would change my life again. This time, instead of fighting for my freedom, we were fighting for accountability and justice. The civil rights lawsuit she'd prepared was comprehensive, naming the city, the police department, Detective Rodriguez, and the prosecutor's office as defendants. "Marcus, this lawsuit isn't just about compensation for what you've lost," Sarah explained, spreading the documents across her conference table. "It's about forcing systemic change so this doesn't happen to other innocent people." The federal civil rights lawsuit was filed under Section 1983, which allows people to sue government officials who violate their constitutional rights. Sarah had spent months documenting every aspect of my wrongful conviction, building a case that went far beyond simple negligence to show deliberate indifference to my constitutional rights. The lawsuit alleged that Detective Rodriguez had violated my Fourth and 14th Amendment rights by conducting a fundamentally flawed investigation. It claimed that he'd ignored exonerating evidence, failed to properly investigate my alibi, and used suggestive identification procedures that were known to produce false positives. The police department trained Detective Rodriguez on proper investigation techniques, Sarah noted in the filing. They knew that single photo identification was unreliable, that witness memory was fallible, and that corroborating evidence was essential. His failure to follow these protocols was willful disregard for constitutional safeguards. The lawsuit also targeted the prosecutor's office for what lawyers call Brady violations, failing to disclose evidence that could have helped my defense. Even though the security footage hadn't been specifically known to prosecutors, their failure to ensure proper investigation constituted prosecutorial misconduct. The prosecution has an affirmative duty to ensure that investigations are thorough and that defendants receive all potentially exonerating evidence, the lawsuit stated. Their rubber stamp approval of Detective Rodriguez's inadequate investigation violated Mr. Williams's right to due process. Most importantly, the lawsuit sought not just monetary damages, but institutional reforms. Sarah had included demands for policy changes, training requirements, and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future wrongful convictions. She wanted the police department to implement mandatory protocols for witness identification, evidence preservation, and alibi verification. The city's initial response was predictably defensive. They filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that individual officers couldn't be held liable for good faith mistakes made during criminal investigations. They claimed that Rodriguez had followed standard procedures and that my conviction was the result of an unfortunate combination of circumstances rather than constitutional violations. Mr. Williams received a fair trial with competent legal representation. The city's attorney argued in court. The fact that new evidence later emerged doesn't mean his constitutional rights were violated during the original investigation. Sarah systematically dismantled these arguments. She presented evidence showing that Rodriguez's investigation fell far below accepted standards, that the police department had policies in place that he'd ignored, and that the pattern of shortcuts and rushed conclusions constituted deliberate indifference to constitutional rights. The discovery process revealed even more damaging information about the police department's practices. Internal documents showed that Detective Rodriguez had been criticized by supervisors for cutting corners in previous investigations, but those criticisms had never resulted in additional training or closer supervision. Email communications between Rodriguez and his captain showed explicit pressure to close cases quickly, regardless of the strength of evidence. "Clear your desk fast," Captain Walsh had written in one email. The mayor's breathing down my neck about clearance rates. Dr. Samuel Morrison, an expert on police practices and wrongful convictions, testified about the systematic problems revealed. By my case, he'd studied hundreds of wrongful convictions and identified patterns that led to innocent people being imprisoned. The Williams case represents a perfect storm of investigative failures, Dr. Morrison explained during his deposition. Tunnel vision, confirmation bias, pressure for quick closure, and inadequate supervisional. The factors that research has identified as leading to wrongful convictions. The lawsuit also documented the broader impact of my wrongful conviction. 3 years of lost income, destroyed career prospects, psychological trauma, and damage to family relationships. Sarah had commissioned economic experts to calculate not just what I'd lost, but what the wrongful conviction would cost me over my entire lifetime. Mr. Williams was a 25-year-old man with steady employment and clear career advancement potential. Economist Dr. Jennifer Valdez testified. The wrongful conviction destroyed his earning capacity, damaged his employability, and will affect his economic prospects for the rest of his life. The psychological evaluation commissioned for the lawsuit revealed the extent of trauma caused by wrongful imprisonment. Dr. Patricia Chen, a specialist in post-traumatic stress, diagnosed me with PTSD, anxiety disorder, and adjustment difficulties. Related to my wrongful conviction, 3 years of imprisonment for a crime he didn't commit has caused lasting psychological damage. Dr. Chen wrote in her report, Mr. Williams suffers from hypervigilance, difficulty trusting authority figures, and recurring nightmares about being wrongfully accused again. Perhaps most importantly, the lawsuit forced public examination of practices that had led to other wrongful convictions. Sarah's investigation revealed that Detective Rodriguez had used similar questionable tactics in at least 6 other cases during the same time period. Defense attorneys began reviewing their clients' cases, looking for similar patterns of inadequate investigation. The civil rights lawsuit became more than just my fight for justice. It became a catalyst for broader examination of police practices and prosecutorial accountability. Local newspapers ran investigative series about wrongful convictions, and reform organizations used my case as an example of why systemic change was necessary. This lawsuit isn't about revenge, I told reporters during a press conference outside the courthouse. It's about making sure the system works better for everyone. No innocent person should go through what I experienced, and no family should suffer what my mother endured. The federal civil rights lawsuit represented my attempt to transform personal injustice into institutional accountability, to ensure that my 3 years in prison would lead to changes that protected other innocent people from similar fates. The internal police emails that Sarah's lawsuit uncovered were more damaging than anyone had anticipated. Through court-ordered discovery, we gained access to electronic communications between Detective Rodriguez, his supervisors, and the prosecutors. Office communications that revealed a deliberate effort to suppress evidence that could have exonerated me. The most shocking email was dated 3 days after my arrest. Sent from Detective Rodriguez to Captain Dennis Walsh with the subject, Line Williams Case, Potential Complications. In it, Rodriguez acknowledged that he'd been contacted by the warehouse security manager about available footage, but he recommended against pursuing it. Warehouse guy says they have security cameras covering all work areas, Rodriguez had written. Could complicate things if Williams really was there during the robbery. Witness ID is solid, and we need to close this fast. Recommend we skip the workplace footage and proceed with prosecution. Captain Walsh's response was equally damaging. Agreed. Don't muddy the waters with unnecessary evidence. We have enough for conviction. This wasn't negligent was deliberate suppression of potentially exonerating evidence. The emails showed that police officials knew about the security footage and made a conscious decision not to request it because it might contradict their theory of the case. Even more damaging were communications between Captain Walsh and Assistant District Attorney James Morrison, the prosecutor who had handled my case. These emails revealed coordination between police and prosecutors to avoid investigating evidence that might undermine their conviction. "Williams looks good for this," Morrison had written to Walsh. "Keep it simple, witness ID, circumstantial evidence, no complicated alibis to confuse the jury. Defense attorney seems overwhelmed, so this should be straightforward." Walsh had responded, "Copy that. Rodriguez is keeping investigation focused on confirming guilt rather than exploring alternatives. Should have this wrapped up by week's end." The phrase confirming guilt rather than exploring alternatives became central to Sarah's lawsuit. It showed that the investigation was designed not to find the truth, but to build a case against me regardless of my actual innocence or guilt. Dr. Margaret Foster, a criminal justice professor who specializes in police misconduct, testified that these emails revealed what scholars call noble cause corruption, law enforcement, officials breaking rules because they believe they're serving a greater good. These emails show officers who convinced themselves that Mr. Williams was guilty, and therefore justified in cutting corners to ensure conviction. Dr. Foster explained, "They prioritized case closure over constitutional protections, believing that the ends justified the means." The email trail also revealed political pressure from the mayor's office to improve crime clearance statistics. Mayor Patricia Coleman had been facing criticism about rising crime rates, and her office had issued directives to police leadership about the need for quick case resolution. "The public is losing confidence in our ability to solve crimes," Mayor Coleman had written. To Police Chief Robert Martinez, "I need to see those clearance numbers improve, whatever it takes." Chief Martinez had forwarded this message to his captains with the note, "You heard the mayor. Close cases fast and don't second-guess witness identifications. We need wins on the board." These communications created a paper trail showing how political pressure had filtered down through the police hierarchy, ultimately influencing the quality of individual investigations. The emphasis on speed and statistics had created an environment where constitutional safeguards were viewed as obstacles rather than protections. Sarah also uncovered emails showing that the prosecutor's office was aware of problems with Detective Rodriguez's investigations but chose not to address them. Internal communications revealed that Rodriguez had a pattern of rushing cases and avoiding evidence that complicated prosecutions. Rodriguez tends to develop tunnel vision, Prosecutor Lisa Hartman had written to her supervisor, "But his cases stick in court, so I don't ask too many questions about his methods." This willful blindness to investigative flaws showed institutional failure at multiple levels. Police supervisors ignored Rodriguez's shortcuts, prosecutors rubber-stamped his investigations, and city officials prioritized statistics over justice. The cover-up extended beyond my individual case. Email searches revealed similar patterns in other investigations conducted by Rodriguez during the same time period. In at least 4 other cases, he'd avoided pursuing evidence that might have contradicted witness identifications or challenged prosecution theories. Defense attorneys representing other Rodriguez cases began filing appeals based on the newly discovered emails. The revelations triggered a broader review of convictions obtained through investigations that prioritized speed over thoroughness. Judge Patricia Hawkins, who had presided over my exoneration hearing, issued a rare judicial statement criticizing the institutional failures revealed by the email discovery. "These communications show a systematic disregard for constitutional protections that undermines the integrity of our criminal justice system," she wrote. The internal emails also revealed attempts to cover up the mistakes after my conviction. When the Innocence Project first began investigating my case, Captain Walsh had instructed officers not to cooperate with defense investigators. "Don't volunteer information to Williams's new attorney," Walsh had written. "Let them figure out their own case. We followed proper procedures and shouldn't second-guess a jury verdict." This obstruction of post-conviction investigation showed That the cover-up continued even after my wrongful conviction had been secured. Officials were more concerned with protecting their reputations than with correcting injustice. The email revelations transformed my civil rights lawsuit from a case about individual misconduct to evidence of systematic corruption. They showed that my wrongful conviction wasn't an unfortunate mistake, it was the predictable result of an institutional culture that prioritized convictions over truth. These emails reveal the true cost of treating justice like a business, Sarah argued in court. When police and prosecutors focus on statistics rather than truth, innocent people go to prison and guilty people remain free to commit more crimes. Internal police emails became the smoking gun that exposed not just individual wrongdoing, but institutional corruption that had affected dozens of cases and destroyed countless lives. The medical records that Sarah subpoenaed as part of our civil rights lawsuit told a story of systematic destruction that went far beyond my own suffering. My mother's health had deteriorated dramatically during my 3 years of imprisonment, and the documentation painted a clear picture of how wrongful conviction destroys entire families. Dr. Patricia Ramirez, my mother's cardiologist, had been treating her for high blood pressure and chest pains since 2019, but her medical records showed a sharp decline beginning in October 2021, the month of my arrest. Her blood pressure spiked to dangerous levels. She developed heart palpitations, and she began suffering from chronic insomnia. Mrs. Williams was a relatively healthy 62-year-old woman before her son's arrest. Dr. Ramirez testified during our lawsuit proceedings. The stress of his wrongful conviction triggered a cascade of health problems that have permanently affected her cardiovascular system. The medical records showed that my mother had been hospitalized twice during my imprisonment, once for chest pains so severe that doctors feared she was having a heart attack, and once for fainting spells caused by stress and malnutrition. She'd been losing weight steadily, often forgetting to eat, while focused on my legal case. Dr. Ramirez had prescribed medication for anxiety and depression, but my mother had often skipped doses to save money for my legal defense. The doctor's notes documented her reluctance to spend money on her own healthcare when those funds could be used to hire investigators or expert witnesses for my appeal. Patient reports, sleeping 2 to 3 hours per night. Dr. Ramirez had written in one chart entry. Spends most evenings researching legal precedents and writing letters to attorneys. Patient states she cannot rest until my son comes home. The most heartbreaking entries in her medical records were the notations about her mental state during routine appointments. Patient, tearful throughout exam, appeared repeatedly. Continues to blame herself for inability to prove son's innocence. Reports nightmares about son being hurt in prison. My mother had aged years in those 3 years, not just from the natural progression of time, but from the crushing weight of fighting an indifferent system. The photographs Sarah compiled for our lawsuit showed the transformation. From a vibrant woman in her early 60s to someone who looked frail and beaten down by circumstances beyond her control. But the day of my exoneration changed everything. Dr. Ramirez later documented the immediate improvement in my mother's condition after my release. Her blood pressure stabilized for the first time in 3 years, she began sleeping through the night, and her anxiety symptoms diminished significantly. Mrs. Williams experienced what we call a trauma resolution response, Dr. Ramirez explained. When the source of chronic stress was removed by her son's exoneration, her body began to heal from 3 years of constant fight-or-flight activation. However, the damage wasn't entirely reversible. The prolonged stress had weakened her heart, muscle and increased her risk of future cardiovascular problems. She would need medication and monitoring for the rest of her life. Permanent consequences of the system's failure to protect innocent people and their families. The vindication my mother felt when I was exonerated was profound and complex. She'd spent 3 years being told by authorities that her son was a violent criminal, that her belief in my innocence was maternal delusion, that she needed to accept reality and move on. The discovery of the security footage and DNA evidence proved that she'd been right all along. I never doubted you for 1 second, she told me after reading Judge Hawkins's exoneration order. Not 1 second, Marcus. I knew in my heart that you were innocent, and I knew that someday everyone else would see it too. But vindication came with its own emotional challenges. My mother felt anger at all the people who had dismissed her concerns, who had treated her like a grieving parent, unable to accept her son's guilt. She'd been patronized by police officers, ignored by prosecutors, and told by well-meaning friends that she needed to face facts. Dr. Martinez, the therapist I'd been seeing since my release, explained that family members of wrongfully convicted people often struggle with their own form of post-traumatic stress. They've been secondary victims of injustice, forced to watch helplessly as their loved ones suffer for crimes they didn't commit. Your mother carried a tremendous burden, Dr. Martinez told me during one of our sessions. She had to maintain hope in the face of hopelessness, fight a system designed to wear her down, and preserve her faith in justice when everything suggested it didn't exist. The medical records became crucial evidence in our civil rights lawsuit, demonstrating the broader impact of wrongful conviction on innocent families. Sarah used them to argue that the damages we were seeking should include compensation for my mother's suffering, not just my own losses. The constitutional violations that led to Mr. Williams's wrongful conviction didn't just harm him, Sarah argued in court. They destroyed his mother's health, bankrupted her financially, and caused lasting trauma that will affect her for the rest of her life. My mother's vindication also inspired her to become an advocate for other families dealing with wrongful conviction. She began attending support group meetings for families of imprisoned people, sharing her story and offering hope to parents who were facing similar struggles. Don't give up, she would tell other mothers. Don't let them convince you that you're wrong about your child. Keep fighting, keep believing, and keep looking for the truth. It's out there, and someday it will come to light. The medical records that documented my mother's suffering during my imprisonment became a testament to her unwavering love and determination. They showed that she'd literally sacrificed her health to fight for my freedom, proof of a mother's love that no wrongful conviction could destroy. Her vindication was sweet, but it came at a cost that could never be fully repaid. 3 years of her life spent in anguish, fighting for a truth that should have been obvious from the beginning. The psychological evaluation that Dr. Lisa Martinez conducted 6 months after my release revealed trauma that went deeper than I'd realized. For 3 years, I'd focused on surviving prison and maintaining hope for exoneration. Now that I was free, the full psychological impact of wrongful conviction was finally surfacing. Mr. Williams presents with classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder related to institutional trauma. Dr. Martinez wrote in her comprehensive assessment, his experiences of wrongful imprisonment, betrayal by the justice system, and loss of fundamental trust in authority figures have created lasting psychological wounds that will require extensive therapeutic intervention. The evaluation documented specific symptoms that I'd been experiencing since my release. Hypervigilance, constantly scanning my environment for threats, inability to relax, even in safe situations, intrusive thoughts about being wrongfully accused, again, panic attacks triggered by police sirens or news stories about criminal arrests, sleep disturbances filled with nightmares about being back in prison. I wake up every morning and for just a moment, I think I'm still in that cell, I told Dr. Martinez during one of our sessions. Even when I'm in my mother's house, even when I can see the sunlight through the windows, part of me expects to hear that prison wake-up bell. Dr. Martinez explained that wrongful conviction creates a unique form of trauma that differs from other types of PTSD. Unlike victims of accidents or crimes, wrongfully convicted people are traumatized by the very institutions that society trusts to provide safety and justice. This institutional betrayal makes recovery particularly challenging. Your trauma isn't just about the years you lost or the conditions you endured in prison, she explained. It's about the fundamental violation of trust in systems that are supposed to protect innocent people. When those systems fail so completely, it shakes your basic beliefs about fairness, safety, and truth. The psychological evaluation also assessed my adjustment difficulties since release. Simple tasks like grocery shopping or driving felt overwhelming after 3 years of institutional control. I'd developed what psychologists call learned helplessness after years of having every decision made for me. I struggled with basic choices about how to spend my time or what to eat for breakfast. Employment was particularly challenging. The 3-year gap in my work history required explanations, and potential employers were often uncomfortable with the story of wrongful conviction. Even though I'd been exonerated, some people still harbored doubts about my innocence, assuming that anyone who'd been in prison must have done something wrong. There's a stigma that follows exonerees, Dr. Martinez noted in her evaluation. Society struggles to fully accept that innocent people go to prison, so they often treat exonerated individuals with suspicion rather than sympathy. The evaluation documented my difficulties with relationships and trust. During my imprisonment, Jessica had moved on with her life, eventually marrying someone else and starting a family. My friendships had withered during my incarceration, and forming new relationships felt risky and complicated. How do you explain to someone you're dating that you spent 3 years in prison for armed robbery? I asked Dr. Martinez. Even when you tell them you were innocent, you can see the doubt in their eyes. People want to believe the system works, so they assume there must be some truth to the charges. The psychological evaluation also explored my relationship with anger. I'd spent 3 years suppressing rage at the injustice of my situation, focusing on hope and legal appeals rather than dwelling on fury. But freedom brought that anger to the surface, and learning to process it constructively became a major focus of therapy. Anger is a normal response to injustice, Dr. Martinez assured me. You have every right to be furious about what happened to you. The challenge is channeling that anger into positive action rather than letting it consume your life. Dr. Martinez introduced me to other exonerees who were dealing with similar psychological challenges. James Washington, my former cellmate who'd been released 2 years earlier, became a mentor in understanding the unique difficulties of post-exoneration life. The world expects you to be grateful and move on, James told me during one of our coffee meetings. They don't understand that being proven innocent doesn't erase the trauma of being wrongfully convicted. We're supposed to be happy about getting our lives back, but those years are gone forever. The evaluation process was painful but necessary. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that my psychological responses were normal reactions to abnormal circumstances. PTSD, anxiety, and adjustment difficulties were expected consequences of institutional trauma, not signs of personal weakness. Recovery from wrongful conviction isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't matter, she explained. It's about integrating this experience into your life story in a way that allows you to move forward without being defined entirely by injustice. We worked on coping strategies for managing triggers and anxiety, breathing exercises for panic attacks, grounding techniques for dissociative episodes, and cognitive behavioral therapy for addressing negative thought patterns. The process was slow and sometimes frustrating, but gradually I began to feel more stable and hopeful. The psychological evaluation became part of the evidence in our civil rights lawsuit, documenting the lasting mental health consequences of wrongful conviction. But more importantly, it became the foundation for my healing process, helping me understand that recovery was possible even after such profound injustice. You survived 3 years of wrongful imprisonment with your integrity intact, Dr. Martinez reminded me during one particularly difficult session. That kind of resilience doesn't disappear just because you're dealing with trauma. You have the strength to rebuild your life, it just takes time and support. The settlement agreement arrived 18 months after my exoneration, a thick document that represented both vindication and the beginning of a new chapter in my life. After lengthy negotiations, the city had agreed to pay $2.8 million in compensation for my wrongful conviction, a sum that could never restore the 3 years I'd lost, but which provided the foundation for rebuilding my life and helping others. Sarah Chen had fought hard for every dollar of that settlement. She'd documented not just my immediate losses, lost wages, destroyed career prospects, emotional trauma, but also the long-term impact on my earning potential and quality of life. Expert economists had calculated that my wrongful conviction would cost me approximately $600,000 in lifetime earnings, even without considering the psychological and social damage. This settlement isn't just about money, Sarah explained as we reviewed the final agreement. It's about institutional accountability. The city is admitting that your constitutional rights were violated and that they're responsible for the consequences. The settlement also included non-monetary provisions that were equally important to me. The police department agreed to implement new protocols for witness identification, requiring double-blind lineups and mandatory recording of all identification procedures. They committed to additional training on investigative best practices and created an independent review board to monitor cases involving potential wrongful conviction. Detective Rodriguez had been forced into early retirement. Though he avoided criminal charges, Captain Walsh was demoted and transferred to a desk job. The institutional changes wouldn't bring back my lost years, but they might prevent other innocent people from experiencing what I'd endured. More personally meaningful was how I chose to use the settlement money. I set aside a significant portion to care for my mother, ensuring she could afford the medical treatment she needed for the health problems caused by stress during my imprisonment. She deserved comfort and security after sacrificing so much for my freedom, but I also wanted the money to serve a larger purpose. I donated $500,000 to the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, the organization that had connected me with Sarah Chen. That donation would fund investigations for other potentially innocent prisoners who couldn't afford expert legal representation. Marcus, this donation will allow us to take on 5 or 6 additional cases, explained Dr. Rebecca Foster, the Innocence Project's director. Your suffering is going to directly help other innocent people gain their freedom. I also used part of the settlement to start a small non-profit organization focused on supporting families of wrongfully convicted people. My mother's experience had shown me how these cases devastate entire families, not just the imprisoned individuals. The organization would provide financial assistance, counseling referrals, and advocacy training for family members navigating the appeals process. The settlement allowed me to pursue education that had been interrupted by my wrongful conviction. I enrolled in community college to complete my bachelor's degree, focusing on criminal justice and social work. My goal was to become a professional advocate for wrongfully convicted people, turning my personal experience into a career helping others. Meeting other exonerees through the Innocence Project introduced me to people who'd survived even longer periods of wrongful imprisonment. Anthony Ray Hinton had spent 30 years on death row before being exonerated. The Central Park Five had each served between 6 and 13 years for a rape they didn't commit. Their stories put my own experience in perspective, while also showing me the possibility of rebuilding a meaningful life after injustice. The settlement also gave me the freedom to speak publicly about wrongful conviction without worrying about immediate financial survival. I began accepting invitations to speak at law schools, police academies, and criminal justice conferences. My story became a teaching tool, helping future lawyers and law enforcement officers understand the human cost of investigative shortcuts and prosecutorial tunnel vision. I'm not here to bash police officers or prosecutors. I would tell these audiences, most of them are good people trying to do difficult jobs. But I'm here to show you what happens when the system fails, and to ask you to be the ones who make sure it doesn't fail again. One of the most unexpected developments was reconnecting with some of my former co-workers from Riverside Warehouse. Tommy Chen and Mike Rodriguez had followed my case through the media, and they reached out after my exoneration to express support and offer references for future employment. Their friendship reminded me that not everyone had forgotten who I was before my wrongful conviction. I also began dating again, something that had seemed impossible during the early months after my release. Meeting Linda Martinez at a criminal justice reform conference felt like fate. She was a social worker who specialized in trauma recovery, and she understood the psychological challenges I was still navigating. Her patience and support helped me believe that love and trust were still possible after institutional betrayal. The settlement agreement represented more than financial compensation. It was official acknowledgement that my wrongful conviction had been a systemic failure rather than an unfortunate accident. It validated everything I'd maintained about my innocence and my mother had sacrificed to prove. This money can't give you back those 3 years, Sarah noted, as we signed the final papers. But it can give you the resources to make sure those years weren't lost in vain. The settlement became the foundation for a new life, dedicated to preventing wrongful convictions and supporting other innocent people trapped in a system that had failed us all. It transformed my victimization into empowerment, my suffering into purpose, and my personal injustice into a tool for broader social change. For the first time since my arrest, I felt genuinely hopeful about the future, not just my own future, but the possibility that my experience could help create a more just system for everyone. The Innocence Project Partnership Agreement I signed 2 years after my exoneration formalized my commitment to helping other wrongfully convicted people. The document established me as a full-time investigator and family advocate, allowing me to turn my personal experience with injustice into professional expertise in fighting it. Marcus, you understand this system from the inside in ways that most advocates never will. Dr. Rebecca Foster explained as we finalized the partnership. Your experience gives you credibility with law enforcement, prosecutors, and families that few people possess. My first case was Robert Chen, a 34-year-old man serving 25 years for murder based on false witness testimony. Like me, he'd maintained his innocence throughout his trial and imprisonment. Like me, he had family members who never stopped believing in him and fighting for his freedom. The parallels were striking and painful. Working with Robert's sister, Maria, reminded me of my mother's tireless advocacy during my own case. She'd mortgaged her house to pay for private investigators, spent weekends in law libraries researching appeals procedures, and visited her brother every week for 8 years. Her dedication was both inspiring and heartbreaking. I know he didn't do this, Maria told me during our first meeting. I know it, the same way your mother knew you were innocent. It's not just faith, it's certainty based on knowing someone's character. The Innocence Project partnership allowed me to combine investigative work with family support services, while attorneys and private investigators handled the legal and forensic aspects of cases. I worked with families to navigate the emotional and practical challenges of fighting wrongful convictions. I helped families understand legal procedures, connected them with counseling services, and most importantly, provided hope based on my own experience of eventual exoneration. When parents felt overwhelmed by the system's indifference, I could tell them honestly that justice was possible. Even after years of delay, my work also involved speaking to law enforcement and judicial audiences about the human cost of wrongful convictions. Many police officers and prosecutors had never met an exoneree, never heard first-hand accounts of how investigative shortcuts and prosecutorial tunnel vision destroyed innocent lives. I'm not here to attack anyone, I would tell these audiences. I'm here to help you understand that wrongful convictions hurt everyone: victims, defendants, families, and the integrity of the entire system. We all have a stake in getting it right. The partnership agreement also committed me to working on legislative reforms designed to prevent wrongful convictions. I testified before state legislatures about the need for better eyewitness identification procedures, mandatory recording of interrogations, and improved access to post-conviction DNA testing. One of the most meaningful aspects of my work was connecting with other exonerees who were struggling with post-release adjustment. The psychological challenges I'd faced: PTSD, difficulty trusting institutions, problems with employment and relationships, were nearly universal among people who'd been wrongfully convicted. The day you're exonerated, everyone expects you to be happy and grateful, I would tell newly released exonerees, but freedom doesn't erase trauma. It's okay to struggle with anger, anxiety, and adjustment problems. Recovery takes time, and you don't have to face it alone. The partnership also allowed me to work on cases that hit close to home. When we discovered that Detective Rodriguez had used similarly flawed investigation techniques in other cases, I helped review those convictions for potential wrongful imprisonment. 3 additional cases showed patterns of rushed investigation, inadequate evidence, and questionable witness identification. My relationship with Linda deepened as we both dedicated our careers to criminal justice reform. Her work with trauma survivors complemented my advocacy for wrongfully convicted people, and together we developed programs that addressed the broader impact of injustice on families and communities. We married in a small ceremony attended by fellow advocates, exonerees, and the legal team that had fought for my freedom. Sarah Chen served as Linda's maid of honor, symbolizing how professional relationships had evolved into deep personal bonds forged through shared commitment to justice. The legislative changes inspired by my case and others began showing results. The state implemented new requirements for police training on eyewitness identification, established an Innocence Commission to review potential wrongful convictions, and created funding for post-conviction DNA testing. These reforms wouldn't help me, but they might prevent future injustices. 5 years after my exoneration, I received news that Kevin Bradley, the man whose crimes had led to my wrongful conviction, had died in prison. I felt no satisfaction in his death, only sadness that his life of crime had caused so much pain for so many people, his victims, my family, and ultimately himself. But Bradley's confession and the DNA evidence that proved my innocence had also led to the exoneration of 2 other men who'd been wrongfully convicted of his crimes. In a strange way, justice had eventually emerged from the chaos of his criminal career and my wrongful conviction. The Innocence Project partnership represented the culmination of my journey from victim to advocate. It gave meaning to my suffering by transforming it into a tool for helping others. Every case we took, every family we supported, every reform we achieved made my lost years feel less like pure tragedy and more like painful preparation for important work. Your story doesn't end with your exoneration, Dr. Foster reminded me during one of our strategy meetings. It begins there. Everything you've experienced, the injustice, the trauma, the recovery becomes part of your ability to help others facing similar struggles. Today, when I speak to audiences about wrongful conviction, I always end with the same message. Truth has power, even when it's delayed. Justice is possible, even when it seems impossible, and every person who refuses to accept injustice makes the system stronger for everyone. The partnership agreement that formalized my work with the Innocence Project became more than a job description. It was a commitment to ensuring that my experience of wrongful conviction would serve a purpose larger than my own pain. It transformed my personal injustice into a lifelong mission to prevent others from suffering what I'd endured. The truth had set me free, and now it was my responsibility to help it free others.